Welcome back to Shadow Trail Files. I'm your host, and today we're venturing deep into the forgotten wildernesses of California. Beyond the crowded cities and famous landmarks lie remote forests, abandoned mining towns, and mountain roads where strange disappearances, terrifying encounters, and unexplained mysteries continue to haunt those who dare to explore them. Some places look peaceful in the daylight, but when darkness falls, the stories become far more disturbing. Before we begin, if you're new here, we document the strange, the terrifying, and the unexplained from America's wildest and most remote places. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Story 1.
I still remember the summer of 2018 when I decided to spend a week alone exploring a forgotten section of the Appalachian Mountains near the border
Of eastern Tennessee, a place so isolated that even experienced hikers avoided it because of how quickly people could become lost among the endless ridges and thick forests. I had been documenting abandoned locations for a small blog and had heard rumors about an old mining settlement hidden deep in the mountains that had been deserted since the 1940s. The locals in a nearby town became strangely quiet whenever I mentioned it. One old man sitting outside a gas station looked directly at me and said, "If you hear someone calling your name after dark, don't answer." I laughed at the warning and assumed it was just another mountain legend. 2 days later, after hiking nearly 10 miles into the wilderness, I found the remains of the settlement. There wasn't much left except a few collapsing wooden structures, rusted tools, and the stone foundations of homes long reclaimed by nature. As evening approached, I decided to camp nearby and continue exploring in the morning. The first few hours after sunset were peaceful. The forest was alive with insects and distant owl calls. Around midnight, however, everything became silent. Not quieter, completely silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. The sudden absence of sound was so unnatural that it woke me from a light sleep. I sat up inside my tent and listened carefully. That's when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through leaves somewhere beyond my camp. Assuming it was a bear, I grabbed my flashlight and called out. But the footsteps stopped immediately. I waited several minutes before unzipping the tent and shining my light into the darkness. Nothing was there. The beam revealed only trees and shadows stretching between them. As I turned to crawl back into the tent, I heard my own name spoken from somewhere in the forest. The voice sounded exactly like my younger brother. The problem was that my brother was hundreds of miles away at home. The voice came again, slightly farther away this time, calling my name in a calm, almost friendly tone. Every warning I'd heard suddenly came rushing back into my mind. I stayed inside the tent and ignored it. For the next hour, the voice moved through the trees, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always sounding like someone I knew. At one point it sounded exactly like my mother. Then it sounded like an old friend. Around 3 in the morning, I finally drifted back to sleep, only to be awakened by something brushing against the outside of the tent. It moved slowly around me in a complete circle. I could hear leaves crunching beneath heavy footsteps. Then came a long, scratching sound running across the side of the fabric. I held my breath and remained completely still. The scratching stopped near my head. A few seconds later, I heard a voice whisper my name from just outside the tent wall, no more than a foot away. I nearly screamed. The whisper sounded human, but there was something wrong with it, as if someone who had never learned how people speak was trying to imitate a human voice. The words stretched unnaturally, and every syllable felt slightly off. I didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally arrived, I packed my gear as quickly as possible and started hiking back towards civilization. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Fresh footprints were following my trail. They weren't animal tracks. They looked human, except they were impossibly large and deep, as though whatever made them was extremely heavy. The tracks appeared only intermittently, disappearing and reappearing beside the path. For the next several miles, I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped, I heard movement in the trees. Every time I turned around, the forest was empty. By late afternoon, I finally reached my vehicle and drove straight back to town. Before leaving, I stopped at the same gas station where I'd met the old man. When I told him what happened, he didn't seem surprised. He simply nodded and asked one question. "Did you answer when it called your name?" I told him no. He looked relieved. Then he quietly explained that, over the years, several hikers had vanished in those mountains after, reporting the same thing, voices of friends and family calling from deep within the woods. Many were never found. I left town that evening and never returned. Years have passed, but I still think about that night whenever I hear my name unexpectedly. Sometimes, in the moments just before sleep, I remember that whisper outside the tent and wonder what would have happened if I had stepped into the darkness to see who was calling. Story 2. I never planned to tell anyone what happened in the Appalachian Mountains, because even now, years later, it sounds impossible. In the fall of 2021, I was working as a freelance photographer, traveling through remote parts of North Carolina, looking for abandoned places to document. One afternoon, I heard about an old fire lookout tower deep in the mountains that had been closed for decades after a series of accidents. Nobody seemed willing to explain what those accidents were, but that only made me more curious. After several hours of driving and hiking, I finally found the tower standing alone on a ridge surrounded by endless forest. It was old, rusted, and partially damaged by storms, but it still offered an incredible view of the mountains. I spent the afternoon taking photographs before deciding to camp nearby. The weather was clear, and the nearest town was miles away. Everything felt normal until shortly after sunset. As darkness settled over the mountains, I climbed the tower one last time to capture a few night photographs. While adjusting my camera, I noticed a small light moving through the forest far below. At first I assumed it was another hiker carrying a flashlight. Then another light appeared, then a third. Within minutes, there were dozens of lights scattered among the trees, all moving slowly uphill toward the tower. What made me uneasy was that they weren't following any trail. They seemed to be drifting through the wilderness in complete silence. I watched for nearly 20 minutes before realizing something even stranger. No matter how close the lights appeared, I couldn't hear voices, footsteps, or branches breaking. The forest remained completely silent. As the lights continued approaching, I climbed down from the tower and returned to my campsite, convincing myself they were probably distant campers. Around midnight, I woke suddenly to the sound of metal creaking above me. The tower, it sounded as though someone was climbing the staircase. Step after step echoed through the darkness. Thinking another hiker had arrived, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The tower stood less than 100 yards away, illuminated by moonlight. I pointed my flashlight toward it and immediately froze. There was nobody on the stairs. Yet the metal steps continued, groaning under the weight of something climbing higher and higher toward the observation deck. The sound stopped only after reaching the top. I stood there staring for several minutes, unable to move. Then a loud metallic bang erupted from the tower above, followed by another. It sounded like someone walking around the observation deck, slamming into the walls. The noises continued for nearly an hour. Every instinct told me to leave, but hiking through unfamiliar mountains in complete darkness seemed even more dangerous. Eventually the sounds stopped. I crawled back into my tent and remained awake until dawn. The next morning, I decided to inspect the tower before leaving. As I climbed the stairs, I noticed fresh, muddy footprints leading upward. At first, I felt relieved because footprints meant there had been a logical explanation. But when I reached the observation deck, my relief disappeared. The footprints ended in the center of the platform. There were no tracks leading down, no signs of anyone climbing back down the stairs, just a trail of muddy prints that stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. Disturbed but determined to leave, I packed my gear and began hiking back toward my vehicle. About halfway down the trail, I noticed something hanging from a tree branch beside the path. It was a photograph. Confused, I picked it up and felt my stomach drop. The picture showed the fire lookout tower taken from a distance during the night. The date stamped on the corner was October 14, 1997, more than 20 years earlier. At first, I thought someone had dropped it recently, but then I looked closer. Standing in the observation deck, at the very top of the tower, was a man staring directly at the camera. His face was blurry, but I could clearly see what he was wearing. It was the exact same jacket I had been wearing the night before. I dropped the photograph and hurried down the mountain. Later, after reaching town, I asked a local historian about the tower. The color drained from his face when he saw the photograph. He explained that in 1997, a photographer had disappeared from that exact location while documenting abandoned structures in the mountains. Search teams found his equipment, but his body was never recovered. The last known photograph from his camera showed the tower at night. When I asked what the missing photographer looked like, the historian pulled out an old newspaper clipping. The picture was faded, but I recognized the face instantly. It was the same man, standing at the top of the tower, in the photograph I had found. The same man who was wearing my jacket. To this day, I still have nightmares about those silent lights moving through the forest. Sometimes, I wake up convinced that I can hear metal stairs creaking somewhere outside my window, as though Something is still climbing higher and higher, higher in the darkness, searching for whoever escaped the mountain that night. Story 3. I grew up hearing stories about the Appalachian Mountains, but I never believed any of them. The old tales about people disappearing, hearing strange noises in the woods, or finding places that weren't supposed to exist, always sounded like exaggerated campfire stories. That changed in October of 2019, when I decided to spend a weekend hiking alone through a remote section of the mountains in eastern Kentucky. The trail I chose wasn't popular and hadn't been maintained in years, which was exactly why I picked it. By the second day, I hadn't seen another person since leaving my truck. The forest seemed endless, with towering trees blocking most of the sunlight, and thick fog lingering between the ridges. Around late afternoon, I noticed something unusual. I came across an old dirt road cutting through the woods. According to my map, there shouldn't have been any road there. Curious, I followed it. The road twisted deeper into the forest until I eventually found a small cluster of buildings hidden among the trees. At first glance, it looked like an abandoned town. There were maybe a dozen structures, all old wooden houses, along with a church and what appeared to be a general store. The strange thing was how untouched everything looked. There were no broken windows, no graffiti, no signs of decay. It was as if the town had simply been frozen in time. As I walked through the empty streets, an overwhelming sense of unease settled over me. The place was silent. Not a single bird, not a single insect. Even the wind seemed absent. I took several photographs and considered exploring one of the houses. But something about the atmosphere made me uncomfortable. That's when I noticed movement behind a curtain in one of the homes. I stopped immediately. Someone was there. I called out, expecting a resident to answer, but nobody responded. The curtain slowly moved back into place. Deciding I didn't want to trespass, I turned around and headed back toward the road. After walking for about 10 minutes, I should have reached the forest trail again. Instead, I found myself standing at the center of the town. Confused, I checked my GPS. It showed me moving, but the location marker kept spinning wildly. I tried another direction. 15 minutes later, I was back at the church. The sun was beginning to set. Panic slowly started replacing confusion. I spent the next hour trying every possible route out, but no matter where I walked, I always ended up back in the town. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Lights were turning on inside the houses. One by one, yellow glows appeared behind curtains and dusty windows. Yet I hadn't seen a single person. The streets remained empty. As darkness settled over the town, I began hearing faint sounds. Doors opening, footsteps inside buildings, the distant sound of conversation. The voices were too quiet to understand, but there were clearly many people speaking. I considered knocking on a door and asking for help, but every instinct screamed at me not to. Instead, I hid behind the general store and waited. Around midnight, I saw the first person. A man stepped out of one of the houses carrying an old lantern. He was dressed in clothing that looked decades out of date. A woman emerged from another house, then another person. Soon dozens of people were walking through the streets. None of them spoke. None of them acknowledged each other. They simply wandered slowly beneath the light, with blank expressions on their faces. I watched in terror as more appeared. Men, women, children. Every single one looked pale and emotionless. Then, without warning, they all stopped moving at the exact same moment. Every head turned in my direction. I was hidden, yet somehow they knew exactly where I was. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then they began walking toward the store. Not running, not speaking, just slowly approaching. I bolted. I ran through the darkness without caring where I was going. Branches tore at my clothes as I crashed through the forest. Behind me, I could hear footsteps. Hundreds of footsteps. The sound seemed to come from every direction at once. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt ready to collapse. Then suddenly I stumbled onto a hiking trail. My actual trail, the one I had been following earlier that day. The forest around me was normal again. Crickets chirped in the darkness. Wind rustled through the trees. The silence was gone. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck shortly before dawn. The next day, after finally getting cell service, I searched old records and historical archives. What I found still haunts me. In the late 1800s, there had indeed been a small mining community in that area. According to local records, the entire town vanished after a devastating epidemic. Survivors abandoned the settlement, and over time the forest swallowed it. The strange part was the location. The coordinates listed in historical documents didn't match where I found the town. They were nearly 20 miles away. I returned a year later with a group of experienced hikers, determined to prove what I had seen. We searched for 3 days. Wild. We found the dirt road. We found the ridge. We found the exact area where the town should have been. But there was nothing there. No houses, no church, no general store, only dense forest stretching in every direction. Sometimes I still look through the photographs from that trip. Most show empty streets and abandoned buildings. But in one picture, taken just before sunset, there's a figure standing in the doorway of the church, a pale man staring directly at me. I don't remember seeing him when I took the photo, and every time I zoom in on his face, I get the uncomfortable feeling that he's smiling a little more than he was the last time I looked. Story 4. I never believed the stories about people vanishing in the Appalachian Mountains until I became one of the last people to see someone before they disappeared. It happened in November 2020 when I decided to spend 4 days hiking through a remote section of the mountains in western Virginia. The weather forecast was perfect, and I was looking forward to a quiet trip away from everything. On the second evening, just before sunset, I reached a small clearing where I planned to camp for the night. While setting up my tent, I noticed another camper about 200 yards away near the tree line. He was a man in his late 30s, wearing a dark backpack and sitting beside a small campfire. We exchanged a quick wave, but never spoke. As darkness settled over the forest, I cooked dinner, listened to the sounds of the woods, and eventually climbed into my sleeping bag. Around 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of someone screaming. It wasn't a brief yell. It was a desperate, terrified scream that echoed through the mountains. I immediately sat upright and listened. The scream came again, followed by a shout for help. It was coming from the direction of the other camper. Grabbing my flashlight, I rushed out of the tent and began running toward his campsite. The moment my light swept across the clearing, I stopped. The campfire was still burning. His backpack was still there. His tent was standing exactly where it had been earlier, but the man was gone. I called out repeatedly, expecting an answer, but the only response was silence. Then I noticed something strange. Fresh footprints led away from the campsite and into the forest. Relieved that I at least had a direction to follow, I started after them. The track continued for several hundred yards before abruptly stopping in the middle of a patch of muddy ground. There was nowhere else they could have gone. No tracks leading left. No tracks leading right. No signs of a struggle. It was as if the man had simply vanished. A growing sense of fear convinced me to return to my own campsite and wait until morning. I barely slept. Every small sound outside the tent felt threatening. At dawn, I returned to the other campsite and discovered that nothing had changed. The man's gear remained untouched. His food sat beside the fire. His vehicle keys were inside the tent. There was no sign that he had packed up or left voluntarily. After hiking back to civilization, I contacted local authorities and reported everything. Search teams spent days combing the area. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers searched miles of forest. They never found him. Weeks later, I received a call from one of the investigators. He wanted to know whether I had noticed anything unusual that night besides the scream. At first I said no, but then I remembered something I had dismissed at the time. A few minutes before hearing the scream, I had been half asleep when I heard what sounded like someone walking slowly around my tent. I assumed it was a deer or another hiker. The investigator became very quiet and asked me to describe the footsteps. I explained that they sounded strange, almost as if whoever was walking would take 3 or 4 steps, stop for several seconds, then continue. After a long pause, he told me that several missing person reports from that region included similar details. People would report hearing slow footsteps circling their campsites shortly before someone disappeared. The investigator wouldn't say anything more. Months passed, and life eventually returned to normal. Then, one evening, while organizing photographs from that hiking trip, I found a picture I didn't remember taking. It had been captured accidentally while I was setting up my camera near sunset. The image showed the clearing and the distant campsite of the missing man. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, I zoomed in on the tree line behind him. Standing between 2 trees was a tall figure. It appeared human, but its proportions were wrong. Its arms hung unusually low, almost reaching its knees. Its face was hidden in shadow, yet it seemed to be staring directly toward the campsite. I assumed it was a trick of light until I enlarged the image further. The figure wasn't standing behind the trees. It was standing between them, impossibly thin, almost blending into the darkness itself. I showed the photograph to several people, but nobody could explain what it was. The most disturbing part came a year later when I returned to the same area with a friend. I had no intention of staying overnight. I only wanted to prove to myself that the place wasn't as frightening as I remembered. We reached the clearing in the afternoon. The forest looked normal. The campsite where the man had vanished was overgrown and empty. While exploring, my friend suddenly called my name, standing beside a tree with a confused expression on his face. Carved into the bark were several names. Some belonged to known missing hikers from the area. One of them matched the name of the man who had disappeared that night. Beneath the names was a message carved deeply into the wood. It waits until you look away. We left immediately. To this day, the man has never been found. The official case remains unsolved. But sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I remember those strange footsteps circling my tent and the distant scream echoing through the mountains. And I can't stop wondering whether the figure in the photograph had been watching both of us all along, waiting for the moment when one of us looked away. Story 5. I thought I knew the Appalachian Mountains better than most people. For nearly 10 years, I had spent every fall exploring remote trails, photographing abandoned cabins, and camping in places where few hikers ever went. That's why what happened in October 2022 still bothers me more than anything else I've experienced. I had chosen a forgotten section of forest deep in eastern Kentucky, an area known for old mining roads and settlements that had been abandoned generations ago. The first day passed without incident. I hiked nearly 15 miles and eventually found an old cabin hidden among the trees. It looked as though nobody had visited it in decades. The windows were boarded up. The roof sagged under years of weather damage, and vines crawled across the walls. Since a storm was expected that night, I decided to camp nearby. As darkness settled over the mountains, heavy fog rolled through the forest, swallowing the trees one by one until my flashlight beam could barely penetrate more than a few yards ahead. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of knocking. 3 slow knocks. Not on a tree, not from the forest, on the cabin door. I sat upright inside my tent and listened. A minute passed. Then 3 more knocks echoed through the darkness. Whoever or whatever was knocking wasn't trying to break in, it was waiting. Curious and slightly unnerved, I stepped outside. The fog was so thick that the cabin appeared as nothing more than a dark shape in the mist. I shined my flashlight toward it. Nothing moved. Then the knocking came again. 3 slow knocks. I could hear them clearly. They were coming from inside the cabin. Every instinct told me to leave, but curiosity won. I approached the building and climbed the rotting wooden steps. The front door hung slightly open. When I pushed it wider, a wave of cold air drifted out. The cabin was empty. Dust covered the floor. Broken furniture lay scattered across the room. There was nobody inside, yet moments earlier I had heard knocking. I searched every corner before finally convincing myself that the old structure had simply been making noises as it settled. Feeling foolish, I returned to my tent. About an hour later, I woke again. This time, it wasn't the knocking that disturbed me. It was the sound of someone walking around my campsite. Slow footsteps circled my tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They moved carefully through the leaves, never getting closer, never moving farther away, just circling. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The footsteps stopped instantly. The forest was silent. I swept the beam through the fog, but saw nothing. As I was about to crawl back inside, I noticed something near the cabin. A light. It glowed faintly behind one of the boarded windows. My stomach tightened. There hadn't been any light before. I stared for several seconds, trying to convince myself it was a reflection. Then the light moved. It passed slowly across the window from one side to the other, as though someone inside was carrying a lantern. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, I packed my gear and decided to leave. Before heading out, I walked over to the cabin one final time. The door was exactly as I'd left it. The interior remained empty, but on the dusty floor near the center of the room, I found something that hadn't been there earlier. Fresh footprints. A single set of bare human footprints crossing the room. They appeared near one wall, walked directly through the center, and ended at another wall. There was no doorway where they began, no doorway where they ended. The prints simply appeared and disappeared. Disturbed, I started hiking back toward my truck. Several miles later, I reached an old trail marker and stopped to rest. That's when another hiker, approaching from the opposite direction. He was an older man carrying a hunting rifle. We talked briefly, and I mentioned the cabin. The man's expression changed immediately. He asked me to describe its location. After listening carefully, he nodded and told me a story that I still can't explain. According to local records, a family had lived in that cabin during the 1930s. One winter, neighbors noticed smoke no longer rising from the chimney. When they finally checked on the family, everyone inside had vanished. Their meals were still on the table. Personal belongings remained untouched. The front door was locked from the inside. No tracks led away from the cabin, despite fresh snow covering the ground. The entire family simply disappeared. Since then, hikers and hunters had occasionally reported seeing lights inside the abandoned structure or hearing knocking after dark. Most locals avoided the area completely. I thanked the man and continued toward my vehicle, eager to put the mountains behind me. That evening, after returning home, I began reviewing photographs from the trip. Most were normal landscapes and forest scenes. Then I reached a photo I had taken of the cabin just before sunset. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary, but when I zoomed into one of the windows, my heart nearly stopped. Standing inside the dark room was a woman. She wasn't visible when I took the picture. Her face was pale, her expression blank, and she appeared to be staring directly at me through the glass. I checked every other photograph. She appeared only once. The worst part wasn't her presence. It was what stood behind her. Several shapes were visible in the darkness of the room, barely distinguishable from the shadows. Human figures, motionless, watching from the back of the cabin. I deleted the photographs that night, but the image never left my mind. Even now, whenever someone knocks on a door, 3 times, in slow succession, I feel a chill run through me and remember that fog-covered cabin hidden deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains, waiting quietly among the trees, as though something inside still expects its missing family to come home. Story 6. I never told anyone about what happened in the Appalachian Mountains during the winter of 2021 because I knew exactly how it would sound. People would assume I was mistaken, exhausted, or simply making the story up. The truth is far stranger. It began when I decided to spend a weekend exploring an abandoned fire road deep in the mountains of West Virginia. Snow had fallen the previous night, covering the forest in a thick white blanket. The weather was cold but clear, and I wanted to photograph the wilderness before another storm moved in. For most of the day, everything felt normal. The forest was silent except for the occasional crack of ice-covered branches. Around late afternoon, I discovered an old ranger station hidden among the trees. The building looked abandoned for decades. Its windows were broken, the paint had long since peeled away, and part of the roof had collapsed under years of heavy snow. Curious, I spent nearly an hour photographing the structure, the fossil, before deciding to continue down the trail. As I walked away, I noticed something strange in the snow ahead of me. Footprints. Fresh footprints. They appeared to belong to a barefoot person. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The temperature was well below freezing. Nobody could walk barefoot through that wilderness for long, yet there they were, perfect human footprints pressed deeply into the snow. The tracks emerged from the forest, crossed the road, and disappeared back into the trees. Curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The footprints led deeper into the mountains than I had intended to go. After nearly 30 minutes, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The tracks were changing. They no longer looked entirely human. Each footprint seemed slightly longer than the last. The toes became stretched and oddly shaped. By the time I realized how far I had wandered, daylight was fading fast. Deciding to head back, I turned around and immediately froze. My own footprints behind me were gone. Every track I had made in the snow had vanished. The untouched white surface stretched down the trail as though nobody had walked there all day. I stood there, staring in disbelief. There had been no wind, no fresh snowfall, nothing that could have erased them. A growing sense of panic pushed me into motion. I began walking quickly, trying to retrace my route. As darkness settled over the mountains, I noticed another problem. The forest no longer looked familiar. Landmarks I remembered had disappeared. Trees seemed different. The trail itself appeared narrower than before. Then, I heard a sound somewhere behind me, a single crunch in the snow. I stopped. Silence. Several seconds later, another crunch echoed through the darkness. Whatever made the sound was following me. Every time I walked, it walked. Every time I stopped, it stopped. The distance between us never seemed to change. Soon night completely swallowed the forest. My flashlight beam illuminated only a small tunnel through the darkness. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming. Then I saw movement ahead. About 50 yards away stood a figure between the trees. At first I thought it was another hiker. Relief washed over me until the figure stepped forward into the light. It was impossibly tall. Its body was thin to the point of looking unnatural, and its pale skin seemed almost white against the darkness. The thing stood completely motionless, watching me. I shouted, asking if it needed help. It didn't respond. It simply tilted its head slightly to one side. Then another figure appeared farther back among the trees. Then another. My fear finally overcame my curiosity. I turned and ran. Branches whipped across my face as I crashed through the forest. Behind me came the sound of footsteps. Not one set. Many. They moved through the snow with impossible speed. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like an hour of running, I spotted a faint light ahead. It was the ranger station. Somehow I had returned to the abandoned building. Desperate for shelter, I forced open the door and barricaded myself inside. The station was dark and freezing, but at least it felt safer than the forest. For several minutes I heard nothing. Then came the scratching. Long, slow scratches dragged across the exterior walls. Something circled the building. Occasionally I heard footsteps crunching in the snow, just outside the windows. The noises continued throughout the night. Sometimes they were close, sometimes they seemed farther away. But they never completely stopped. I remained awake until dawn. When sunlight finally entered the station, the sounds disappeared. Gathering my courage, I stepped outside and looked around. Fresh snow covered the ground. There was not a single footprint anywhere near the building except my own. Confused and exhausted, I started hiking back towards civilization. A few hours later, I reached my truck and drove to the nearest town. While eating breakfast in a small diner, I mentioned the ranger station to an elderly local sitting nearby. The man became unusually quiet. After a long pause, he explained that decades earlier several people had gone missing in that section of forest during winter. Most were never found. The few who survived described seeing pale figures watching them from among the trees. According to local legend, the mountains contained places where people could accidentally wander into something that wasn't entirely part of our world. I laughed nervously and dismissed it as folklore. Then the man asked me a question that made my blood run cold. "When you followed those footprints," he said, "did they start out looking human?" I stared at him without answering. He nodded slowly. "They always do." I left town immediately and never returned to that area. But the most disturbing part came months later while reviewing my photographs. In one image of the abandoned ranger station, taken before I found the footprints, a figure can be seen standing in the broken second floor window. The problem is that the second floor had collapsed years earlier. There was no floor for anyone to stand on. Yet the pale shape remains there in the photograph, staring down at me from the darkness, as if it had been watching long before I ever noticed it. Story 7. I thought the worst thing that could happen in the Appalachian Mountains was getting lost. After what happened in the fall of 2023, I learned there are things far worse than being lost. Because, at least when you're lost, you know you're still in the same world. I had taken a week off work to hike through a remote section of the mountains in eastern Tennessee, far from the crowded trails and tourist areas. On the third day, I found an old path that wasn't marked on any map I carried. It looked ancient, barely visible beneath fallen leaves, but it was clearly man-made. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed it deeper into the forest. The farther I walked, the stranger the woods became. There were no birds, no insects, no animal tracks. Even the wind seemed absent. It felt as though the entire mountain was holding its breath. After nearly 2 hours, I came across a small wooden bridge in a narrow creek. The bridge looked incredibly old, weathered by decades of rain and snow. Carved into one of the support beams were words so faded I could barely read them. "Don't cross after dark." I laughed when I saw it, assuming it was some old local joke. By then, the sun was already beginning to sink behind the ridges. I considered turning back, but decided to continue for another mile before making camp. On the other side of the bridge, the forest changed almost immediately. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches twisting overhead until very little sunlight reached the ground. The air felt colder. Not naturally cold. Wrong somehow. Every step deeper into the woods filled me with growing unease. About 30 minutes later, I found a clearing and set up my tent. As night settled over the mountains, an unnatural fog drifted through the trees. It moved slowly, almost deliberately, gathering around the clearing while the rest of the forest remained visible beyond it. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of voices. At first, they seemed distant, like people having a conversation somewhere among the trees. Then I realized I couldn't understand a single word they were saying. The voices weren't speaking any language I recognized. They rose and fell in strange rhythms, sometimes sounding human and sometimes not. I grabbed my flashlight and looked outside. The fog was thicker than before. The beam barely reached a few feet beyond my tent. The voices continued. There were dozens of them now, maybe hundreds. Yet I couldn't see anyone. Then, through the mist, I noticed silhouettes moving between the trees. Tall, dark shapes drifting silently through the forest. They weren't walking. They seemed to glide. I watched in horror as more figures appeared. None approached the clearing. They simply circled it, moving through the fog in complete silence, while the strange voices continued all around me. I stayed frozen inside my tent until dawn. When sunlight finally broke through the trees, the fog vanished and the figures disappeared, determined to leave. Immediately, I packed my gear and started back toward the bridge. After hiking for nearly an hour, I should have reached it. Instead, I found another bridge. It looked identical. Same weathered wood, same creek beneath it, same warning carved into the beam. Confused, I crossed it. 20 minutes later, I found another, then another. Every bridge was exactly the same. Panic began to set in. No matter which direction I walked, I kept encountering the same bridge. By late afternoon, I was exhausted and completely disoriented. That's when I noticed something terrifying. The forest wasn't changing. The same fallen tree lay beside the path. The same oddly shaped boulder sat near the creek. It was as if I had been walking in a giant circle, despite moving in a straight line all day. As darkness approached again, I heard the voices return. This time they were closer, much closer. The fog rolled in rapidly, swallowing the trees one by one. Then I saw them clearly for the first time. Figures standing among the mist. Tall, impossibly thin figures with long limbs and featureless faces. There were dozens of them, maybe more. They stood completely still, watching me. One of them slowly raised an arm and pointed deeper into the forest. Then another did the same. Soon, every figure was pointing in the same direction. I don't know why, but something about the gesture filled me with absolute terror. Every instinct screamed that if I followed where they pointed, I would never come back. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my clothes as I sprinted through the darkness. The voices grew louder behind me, not chasing me, calling to me. The strange language echoed through the mountains, growing more frantic with every step. Suddenly, my foot caught on something, and I crashed to the ground. My flashlight flew from my hand. As I scrambled to my feet, I realized I had fallen beside the original bridge. Moonlight illuminated the warning carved into the wood. Without hesitation, I crossed it. The moment my feet touched the other side, everything changed. The fog vanished. Crickets began chirping. Wind rustled through the trees. It felt as though I had emerged from underwater. I ran until sunrise and didn't stop until I reached my truck. A few weeks later, unable to shake the experience, I searched local archives and historical records. What I found still keeps me awake at night. More than a century ago, several travelers disappeared in that exact region. The last written account came from a surveyor who described finding a bridge that leads to a place that should not exist. His journal ended with a warning written across an entire page. If you cross after dark, do not listen when they call. I never returned to that mountain. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I wake to the sound of distant voices just beyond hearing. And for a few seconds, before I'm fully awake, four pale shapes, I can see pale shapes standing silently at the edge of my room, all of them pointing towards somewhere far away in the darkness. Story 8. I spent 6 years working seasonal jobs in remote parts of the Appalachian Mountains, and during that time, I heard countless stories from hunters, hikers, and locals about places people avoided after dark. Most of those stories sounded exaggerated, but there was one location that everyone seemed genuinely afraid to discuss. They called it the Hollow. Nobody could tell me exactly where it was. Every description was different, yet the warnings were always the same. If you find it, leave before sunset. In October 2022, I accidentally found out why. I was hiking through an isolated area of eastern Kentucky while searching for an abandoned coal camp that had been abandoned since the 1940s. After several hours of following old logging roads, I noticed a narrow trail leading down into a valley that wasn't marked on my map. The path looked rarely used, almost hidden by vegetation. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed it. The descent took nearly 40 minutes. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. Eventually I reached the bottom of a steep basin surrounded by ridges on all sides. The place felt wrong immediately. The air was still. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. Even the trees looked strange, twisted and leaning inward, as though they were growing away from something hidden in the center of the valley. Near the middle of the basin stood the remains of several old buildings. They were little more than collapsing foundations and rotting wood. But it was obvious that a small settlement had once existed there. I spent the afternoon exploring and taking photographs. Around sunset, I noticed something odd. Every sound I made seemed delayed. If I snapped a twig beneath my boot, the crack would echo back a second later. Not from the mountains surrounding me, but from somewhere deeper inside the valley. At first, I assumed it was an unusual acoustic effect. Then I spoke aloud just to test it. "Hello." A second later, the word returned, but it wasn't my voice. The echo sounded almost right, yet slightly distorted, as though someone else had repeated the word after hearing it. A chill ran down my spine. Deciding I had seen enough, I packed my gear and started toward the trail. After 20 minutes of walking, I realized something was wrong. The trail was gone. The valley wasn't large enough to get lost in, yet every direction seemed unfamiliar. The ridges surrounding me looked identical. I checked my GPS. The screen showed a blank grid where the map should have been. Then darkness settled over the basin. That's when the voices began. At first, they sounded distant, drifting through the trees. Men, women, children. Some were laughing. Others were talking quietly. The strange part was that every voice sounded familiar. I couldn't place them immediately, but I knew I'd heard them before. Then I recognized one. It belonged to my grandfather, who had died years earlier. He called my name from somewhere beyond the ruins. I froze. A few moments later, another voice spoke. My high school best friend. Then my mother, then my brother. One after another, voices from different periods of my life echoed through the darkness. They all sounded perfectly real. They all wanted me to come closer. I remembered the warnings I'd heard over the years and forced myself to ignore them. Instead, I continued searching for the trail. The voices grew more desperate. Some begged for help. Some sounded frightened. Others simply repeated my name. Then, through the trees, I saw lights, lanterns, dozens of them. They moved slowly between the ruins, illuminating figures standing among the collapsed buildings. For a brief moment, I felt relief. I thought I'd found other people. Then, one of the figures stepped into clearer view. My relief vanished instantly. It looked like my grandfather, not someone who resembled him. It was him. The same face, the same clothes he wore in old photographs. Yet something was terribly wrong. His expression never changed. He simply stood there smiling too widely, while staring directly at me. More figures emerged from the darkness. Every one of them wore a familiar face. Dead relatives, old friends, people I hadn't seen in years. They watched silently while holding lanterns that glowed with a pale yellow light. None blinked. None moved naturally. It felt as though something had copied the appearance of people from my memories, without fully understanding how humans behave. Then they started walking toward me, slowly, silently. Lanterns swaying in the darkness. I ran. Branches tore at my jacket as I crashed through the woods. Behind me, I could hear footsteps and familiar voices calling my name. Sometimes they sounded worried, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading. The harder I ran, the closer seemed to get. Eventually I stumbled down a slope and landed hard against a tree. Dazed, I looked up and found myself standing beside the trail I had originally used to enter the valley. Without thinking, I sprinted uphill. The voices continued behind me until I reached the ridge. Then they stopped instantly. The silence was so sudden that it felt unnatural. When I finally looked back, the valley below appeared completely empty. No lights, no figures, nothing. A month later, I visited a local historical society while researching abandoned settlements in the region. An elderly volunteer listened carefully as I described the valley. When I finished, she became visibly uncomfortable. She explained that an isolated community had once existed there during the early 1900s. According to local stories, an illness swept through the settlement and killed many residents within weeks. The survivors abandoned the valley soon afterward. Over the decades, hunters occasionally reported hearing voices there after dark. Some claimed they heard dead relatives calling from the woods. Others vanished entirely. Before I left, the woman gave me one final warning. If you ever hear someone you love calling from the mountains at night, she said quietly, make sure you can actually see them before you answer. I never returned to that place, but every now and then, usually when I'm alone, I'll hear someone say my name from another room. The voice always belongs to someone I know, and for a split second before reality catches up, I remember the lanterns moving through the darkness of that forgotten Appalachian Valley, and wonder whether something followed me home from the hollow. I never believed a place could be evil. Haunted, maybe. Dangerous, certainly. But evil, that sounded like something from a movie. Then, I spent one night on an abandoned mountain road, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. And I haven't slept properly since. This happened in late October 2021. I was driving through a remote section of western North Carolina while researching forgotten locations for a documentary project. Near sunset, I stopped at a small diner to ask about old mining towns in the area. Most people ignored the question, but an elderly man sitting near the window quietly told me about a road locals called Dead Ridge Road. According to him, it had been closed for decades after a series of unexplained disappearances. When I asked where it was, he hesitated for several seconds before giving me directions. As I was leaving, he grabbed my arm and said something I'll never forget. If you reach the gate and it's open, don't go through it. If it's closed, don't touch it. I laughed nervously, assuming he was trying to scare me. A few hours later, I found the road. It wasn't marked on any map. Dense forest surrounded it on both sides, and an old, rusted gate blocked the entrance. The strange thing was that the gate stood partially open, just enough for a vehicle to squeeze through. The old man's warning immediately came back to me, but curiosity won. I drove past the gate and continued up the mountain. The road climbed higher and higher through thick forest. For miles, there were no houses, no power lines, no signs of human activity. Darkness fell quickly beneath the trees. About 40 minutes later, I noticed something odd. I hadn't passed a single side road, yet my GPS claimed I was driving in circles. The map showed my vehicle looping around the same small section of mountain, despite moving steadily forward. Assuming it was a signal problem, I ignored it. Then I passed an abandoned pickup truck parked beside the road. Its windows were broken and rust covered most of the body. A few minutes later, I passed it again. Same truck, same location, same shattered windshield. My stomach tightened. I checked the road behind me. There had been no turns, no intersections, nothing. Yet somehow I had returned to the same spot. I kept driving. 10 minutes later, I passed the truck for a third time. By then, panic was beginning to set in. I accelerated, determined to reach the end of the road. Instead, the forest became stranger. Trees crowded closer to the pavement. Their branches stretched over the road like skeletal fingers. The darkness beyond my headlights seemed unnaturally deep. Then I saw a figure standing ahead. A woman. She stood perfectly still in the middle of the road. Relief washed over me. Finally, another person. I slowed the vehicle and rolled down the window. The woman didn't move. As I got closer, my relief disappeared. Something was wrong with her proportions. Her arms hung too low. Her neck seemed slightly too long. Worst of all, she wasn't facing me. She stood in the center of the road with her back turned. I stopped about 20 feet away and called out. The woman remained motionless. Then, without moving her body, her head slowly rotated until she was looking directly at me over her shoulder. I slammed the accelerator and sped past her. In the rearview mirror, she never moved, she simply watched as I disappeared into the darkness. A few miles later, I noticed headlights behind me. Another vehicle. I felt hopeful. The headlights remained several hundred yards back, following at a steady distance. I considered stopping, but something felt wrong. The lights never changed position. No matter how fast or slow I drove, they remained exactly the same distance away. Eventually, I pulled onto the shoulder and stepped out. The road behind me was empty. No vehicle, no headlights, nothing. Yet, seconds earlier, they had been clearly visible. That's when I heard the whispering. Voices drifted from the forest on both sides of the road. At first, they were too quiet to understand. Then they grew louder. Dozens of voices, hundreds, men, women, children, all whispering at once. None sounded human. Their words blended together into a low, impossible murmur that seemed to come from everywhere around me. I jumped back into the truck and drove faster than I ever had in my life. After another 20 minutes, I saw the gate ahead. Relief flooded through me. I had reached the entrance again, but as my headlights illuminated the rusted metal, my relief turned to terror. The gate was closed, completely closed. I remembered exactly how it had looked earlier. It had been partially open. Now it was shut and chained. There was no way a vehicle could pass through. Then I noticed something standing beside it. Figures. Dozens of figures, silent silhouettes, lined the road near the entrance. Their faces remained hidden in darkness. They weren't moving. They were waiting. I threw the truck into reverse and backed away as fast as possible. The figures never approached. They simply watched. Suddenly, the engine died. Every light on the dashboard went dark. The truck rolled to a stop. Silence filled the mountain. Then the whispering returned, closer than before, much closer. I don't remember exactly what happened next. Fear took over completely. Somehow the engine restarted. Somehow I turned the vehicle around. The next thing I clearly remember is seeing sunrise through the windshield as I sped down a normal highway miles away from the mountain. My truck was covered in mud and scratches. The clock on the dashboard showed 7:14 a.m. Nearly 9 hours had passed, yet I remembered only a fraction of that time. A week later, I returned to the diner, hoping to find the old man who had warned me. According to the owner, no one matching my description had been there in years. When I described him more carefully, the owner's expression changed. He pointed to a faded photograph hanging on the wall. My blood ran cold. The man in the picture was the same person who had spoken to me. According to the caption, he had died in 1998. I never went back to Dead Ridge Road. Sometimes I convince myself there must be a rational explanation for everything that happened. Then, I remember one final detail. When I cleaned out my truck several days later, I found a small rusted chain lying on the passenger seat. Attached to it was an old metal tag stamped with a single date. October 31, 1998. The same year the man in the photograph died. I still have that chain. And Halloween night, without fail, I wake up at exactly 3:17 a.m. to the sound of distant whispering outside my window, as if something on that mountain is still waiting for me to come back through the gate. Story 10. I used to think the stories about the Appalachian Mountains were just local legends created to scare tourists. But after what happened to me in the summer of 2024, I understand why so many people who experience something strange out there never talk about it again. I had been hiking alone through a remote section of the mountains in southwestern Virginia, documenting abandoned locations for a video project. On the fourth day of the trip, I discovered something that wasn't marked on any map. An old staircase standing alone in the middle of the forest. There was nothing attached to it. No cabin, no lookout tower, no ruins, just a weathered wooden staircase rising about 15 feet into the air before ending abruptly. It looked ancient, as if it had been sitting there for decades while the forest grew around it. I remembered hearing strange stories online about staircases found deep in remote wilderness areas, but I had always assumed they were fiction. Standing there in person felt different. The staircase shouldn't have existed. I took several photographs and continued hiking, but the image stayed in my mind. By evening, I had set up camp several miles away. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. At first, I assumed it was an animal. Then I realized the footsteps were too deliberate. They moved slowly around my campsite in a perfect circle. One lap, then another, then another, then another. Every time the footsteps passed behind my tent, they paused for a few seconds before continuing. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The forest was empty. Yet the moment I switched the light off, the footsteps resumed somewhere beyond the trees. They continued until dawn. The next morning, I packed my gear and decided to leave the area. As I hiked, I noticed something unsettling. The trail seemed unfamiliar. Landmarks I clearly remembered were missing. Several hours later, I arrived at the staircase again. I checked my map repeatedly. Reaching it should have been impossible. I had been walking in the opposite direction all morning. Uneasy, I left the staircase behind and continued down the trail. By late afternoon, I found it again. Same staircase, same clearing, same crooked tree beside it. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were footprints on the steps, bare footprints. human footprints. They led upward and stopped at the top stair. There were no footprints leading back down. I stared at them for several seconds before backing away. The feeling of being watched suddenly became overwhelming. I hurried deeper into the forest and eventually found another place to camp. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were accompanied by something else. A voice, faint and distant. At first, I couldn't understand what it was saying. Then I realized it was repeating my name, over and over. The voice sounded familiar, like someone I had known years ago. Every few minutes it seemed to move closer to the tent. By 3 a.m., it sounded as though the speaker was standing just outside. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't answer. Eventually, the voice stopped. The next morning, I started hiking before sunrise. My goal was simple: get back to my truck and leave. Around noon, I reached a ridge overlooking miles of forest. Relief washed over me. I could finally orient myself. Then I saw the staircase. It stood on another ridge nearly half a mile away. I froze. There was no possible way I could recognize it from that distance, yet I knew it was the same one. As I watched, a figure appeared at the top. A person stood motionless on the highest step. Even from far, far away, something about the silhouette felt wrong. The proportions weren't quite human. The arms hung too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then the figure slowly raised one arm and pointed directly toward me. Terror hit me instantly. I turned and ran. Branches whipped across my face as I crashed through the woods. I didn't stop for hours. Just before sunset, I finally reached a Forest Service road where I encountered an older ranger. After hearing my story, he became unusually quiet. When I mentioned the staircase, he looked away for several seconds before speaking. He told me that over the years, hikers had occasionally reported finding staircases deep in the mountains. Most were dismissed as misunderstandings or old structures, left behind by forgotten buildings. But there were a few reports that couldn't be explained. People would describe encountering the same staircase in multiple locations. Some claimed they heard voices near it. Others vanished after becoming obsessed with finding it again. Before leaving, the ranger gave me one piece of advice. "If you ever see it again," he said, "don't climb it." I laughed nervously and assured him I wouldn't. 3 months later, while reviewing photographs from the trip, I discovered something that still keeps me awake at night. In every picture I had taken of the staircase, there was a figure standing at the top. The problem was that I hadn't noticed anyone when taking the photos. At first I assumed it was a shadow, but the figure appeared in every image. Same position, same unnatural posture, same dark silhouette watching from above. Then I reached the final photograph. It had been taken accidentally while my camera hung from my shoulder. The image was blurry, but one detail was unmistakable. The figure was no longer standing on the staircase. It was standing behind me. To this day, I refuse to look at those pictures. Sometimes, though, I wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone is standing in the corner of my room. And whenever I check the clock, it always reads the same time, 3:17 a.m. For a few terrifying seconds, before my eyes fully adjust to the darkness, I can almost see the outline of a staircase where there shouldn't be one, rising silently into shadows that seem far deeper than the room itself. Story 11. I never intended to spend the night in the Appalachian Mountains. The plan was simple. Drive to an abandoned community deep in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. Take a few photographs for a documentary project and return before dark. But a wrong turn, a dead GPS signal, and a storm moving in faster than expected turned a routine trip into the most terrifying experience of my life. It happened in November 2023.
The sky was already darkening when I found the old road leading toward the settlement.
According to local records, the community had been abandoned sometime in the 1950s after a flood destroyed much of the area. Most of the buildings were gone, reclaimed by the forest decades ago. As rain began falling, I decided to spend one night there and leave at sunrise. I found the remains of an old church near the center of the settlement and pitched my tent nearby. The storm intensified throughout the evening. Thunder rolled across the mountains while rain hammered against the fabric of my tent. Around midnight, I woke to complete silence. The storm had vanished. No rain, no wind, no thunder. Just silence so deep it felt unnatural. Then I heard the church bell. One loud toll echoed through the darkness. I sat upright immediately. There shouldn't have been a bell. The church tower had collapsed years earlier. I had photographed it myself. A minute later, the bell rang again. Then again. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was pulling a rope high above the ruins. Curiosity overcame fear. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The forest was covered in thick fog. Visibility was terrible, yet I could clearly see the outline of the church ahead. The bell rang once more. This time I noticed something moving near the entrance. A person. At least I thought it was a person. The figure stood perfectly still beneath the broken archway. I called out, assuming another hiker had taken shelter there. No response. The figure remained motionless. Then the bell rang again and the figure stepped inside. Against every instinct I followed. The church interior was dark and empty. Moonlight filtered through holes in the roof, illuminating rows of rotting pews. There was no sign. I swept my flashlight across the room and stopped when the beam landed on something strange carved into the wooden floor near the altar. Names. Hundreds of names. They covered nearly every inch of the wood. Some looked decades old, while others appeared freshly carved. I knelt to examine them. That's when I noticed a name near the center. My name. I froze. The carving looked recent, as though it had been made only hours earlier. Before I could process what I was seeing, a loud crash echoed from somewhere above. I looked toward the bell tower. A shadow moved across an opening near the top. Impossible. The tower had collapsed. There was no upper floor left standing, yet something was up there. Then came another bell toll, so loud it vibrated through the building. I backed away slowly and returned to my tent. Sleep was impossible. For the rest of the night, the bell continued ringing every few minutes. Each toll seemed closer than the last. Just before dawn, I finally drifted into a shallow sleep. I woke to sunlight and birdsong. The fog was gone. Everything felt normal again. Relieved, I packed my gear and prepared to leave. Before departing, I decided to check the church one final time. The names carved into the floor were gone. The wood was untouched. There wasn't a single mark anywhere. Confused, I searched the building and discovered something even stranger. Beneath a pile of debris near the altar lay an old leather-bound ledger. Most of the pages were damaged by moisture, but a few remained readable. The entries appeared to be records kept by the church more than a century earlier. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed a recurring pattern. Every few years, a new list of names appeared. Beside each name was a date. Every person on those lists had disappeared somewhere in the surrounding mountains. The final page stopped me cold. Unlike the others, it appeared brand new. The ink hadn't even faded. There was only one entry written on the page: my full name. Beneath it was a date exactly 1 year in the future. I left the church immediately and drove straight home. Over the following months, I convinced myself the ledger had been some elaborate prank. Stress and exhaustion had probably distorted my memory. Life gradually returned to normal. Then, 6 months later, I received an email from another photographer. He had been exploring abandoned locations and wanted information about the church. Attached were several photographs. My blood ran cold as I opened them. One image showed the church interior. Another showed the collapsed bell tower. Then, I reached the final photograph. It had been taken inside the church, near the altar. Carved deeply into the wooden floor were hundreds of names, clear as day, and near the center was mine. Last week, I checked the calendar and realized something I had tried not to think about for months. The date, written beside my name in the ledger, is now less than 4 months away. Since then, strange things have started happening. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of a distant church bell, even though there are no churches anywhere near my home. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of a motionless figure standing across the street before us. It disappears when I look directly at it. And every morning, without fail, I find a small patch of damp mud on my front porch, as though someone walked there during the night and stood quietly outside my door, listening. I don't know what will happen when that date finally arrives, but deep down, I can't shake the feeling that whatever rang that bell in the mountains isn't finished with me yet. Story 12, I thought I was done with the Appalachian Mountains after everything that had happened over the years. Too many strange encounters, too many unexplained moments. Yet in October 2024, I accepted an invitation from an old friend to join him on a 3-day camping trip in one of the most isolated regions of the mountains in eastern West Virginia. It would be my last trip there. At least that was the plan. The first day was uneventful. We followed an overgrown trail through dense forest, crossed several streams, and eventually reached a high ridge overlooking endless waves of mountains stretching to the horizon. The nearest town was more than 20 miles away. There was no cell service, no roads, and no sign of other hikers. That night, as we sat beside the campfire, my friend mentioned something he had heard from a local hunter before the trip. According to the hunter, there was a section of forest beyond the ridge known as the Quiet Mile. People avoided it because every sound supposedly disappeared there. We laughed about it and forgot the conversation. The next morning, however, we accidentally found it. The change was immediate. One moment, we were listening to birds and rustling leaves. The next moment, everything stopped. Not gradually. Instantly, it felt as though someone had muted the entire world. Even our own footsteps sounded strangely distant. Neither of us spoke much after entering the area. The silence was unsettling in a way I can't properly describe. After nearly an hour of hiking, we discovered an old wooden sign nailed to a tree. Most of the paint had faded away, but a few words remained visible. "Turn back before sunset," we should have listened. Instead, we continued deeper into the forest. Around late afternoon, we came across a small lake hidden among the trees. It wasn't marked on any map. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Something about the place felt ancient, untouched. My friend suggested setting up camp nearby, and despite my growing unease, I agreed. As sunset approached, I noticed something strange about the lake. There were no ripples, none. Even when leaves fell onto the surface, the water remained unnaturally calm. Then I saw movement, a figure standing on the opposite shore. At first, I assumed it was another camper. The distance made details impossible to see. I waved. The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there watching us. Eventually, darkness settled over the forest and the figure disappeared from sight. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of splashing. Relieved to hear any sound at all, I unzipped my tent and looked toward the lake. Moonlight illuminated the water. Something was standing in the center of it, not swimming. Standing, a dark silhouette, motionless on the surface, as though the lake was solid ground. I stared in disbelief. Then the figure began walking. Each step created small ripples that spread across the water. It moved slowly toward our campsite. I immediately woke my friend. The moment he looked at the lake, all color drained from his face. We watched together as the figure approached the shore. About 20 yards away, it stopped. Neither of us could make out its features. It appeared less like a person and more like a human-shaped absence in the darkness. Then, something even worse happened. Another figure emerged from the lake, then another, then another. Dozens of silhouettes rose silently from beneath the water and began walking toward the shore. We didn't wait to see more. We grabbed our gear and ran. The forest beyond the lake was almost completely dark, but fear pushed us forward. Behind us came the sound of hundreds of footsteps splashing through shallow water. For nearly an hour we ran without stopping. Finally, we reached the edge of the quiet mile. The instant we crossed it, sound returned. Wind rushed through the trees. Insects chirped. Branches creaked overhead. The sudden noise felt overwhelming after hours of silence. Exhausted, we stopped to catch our breath. That's when my friend looked behind us and whispered, "Don't turn around." Of course I turned around. Along the edge of the silent forest stood dozens of figures. They were motionless. Watching, none crossed the boundary. They simply remained there among the trees. We continued hiking until sunrise and eventually reached our vehicle. Neither of us spoke much during the drive home. A week later, my friend called me. His voice was shaking. He had been reviewing photographs from the trip. One image showed our campsite beside the lake shortly before sunset. Standing across the water was the figure we had seen. Curious, he zoomed in. Then he zoomed in again. What he discovered terrified him. The figure wasn't facing us. It was facing the lake. The shape we thought was its face had actually been the back of its head. Somehow, despite standing with its back toward us, it had been watching us the entire time. I wish the story ended there. 3 months later, my friend disappeared. His truck was found abandoned near another remote trailhead in the Appalachians. Search teams spent weeks looking for him. They found his backpack, his camera, and his tent, but they never found him. The final photograph on his camera showed a forest clearing at night. Standing between the trees were dozens of dark silhouettes, and near the center of the image, barely visible in the darkness, was my friend. He appeared to be standing among them, facing away from the camera. The official case remains unsolved. Sometimes I still think about that silent lake hidden deep in the mountains. And every now and then, usually just before dawn, I wake up with the overwhelming feeling that someone is standing beside my bed, watching. When I gather the courage to open my eyes, there's never anyone there. But for a split second, before the darkness settles back into normal shadows, I can almost hear water dripping onto the floor, as if something that came out of that lake is still searching for the people who escaped. Story 13. I never planned on returning to the Appalachian Mountains after everything that had happened during my previous trips. But in September 2025, I received a message that I couldn't ignore. It came from an old email account I hadn't used in years. The subject line contained only 4 words. I found the cabin. Attached was a single photograph. The image showed a weathered wooden cabin deep in the mountains, the sound surrounded by dense forest and thick fog. At first, I didn't recognize it. Then I noticed the person standing on the porch. My blood ran cold. It was my friend Daniel, the same friend who had disappeared near the silent lake almost a year earlier. According to search teams, he had vanished without a trace. Yet there he was, staring directly into the camera. The email contained no message, no explanation, and no return address. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. A week later, I drove into a remote section of the Appalachians in eastern Kentucky, where the photo's metadata suggested it had been taken. Locals in the nearest town became visibly uncomfortable when I showed them the picture. One elderly woman immediately crossed herself and refused to look at it. Another man quietly asked where I got it before telling me to leave the area before dark. Nobody would explain why. After several hours of searching old logging roads and overgrown trails, I eventually found the cabin. It looked exactly like the photograph. The structure stood alone in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. The place felt abandoned, yet oddly preserved. There were no signs of decay beyond normal weathering. No broken windows, no collapsed roof. It looked as though someone still maintained it. As evening approached, I cautiously entered. Dust covered most surfaces, but something felt wrong. The dust wasn't evenly distributed. It looked as though people had been moving through the rooms recently. In one bedroom, I discovered footprints pressed into the floorboards beneath a layer of dust. Bare footprints. Dozens of them. They led toward a narrow staircase descending into darkness beneath the cabin. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct warned me to leave immediately. Instead, I turned on my flashlight and followed the stairs. The basement was far larger than it should have been. The beam illuminated rough stone walls, stretching far beyond the cabin's foundation. At first, thought I was looking at an old mine tunnel. Then I realized the walls weren't natural. They had been carved. Strange symbols covered the stone, etched so deeply they remained visible despite their age. The farther I walked, the colder the air became. Eventually, the passage opened into a massive underground chamber. What I saw there nearly stopped my heart. Hundreds of photographs covered the walls from floor to ceiling. Thousands, perhaps. Every photograph showed someone standing somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. Hikers, hunters, campers, families. Some images looked decades old, others appeared recent. Many of the people were smiling. None of them looked aware that they were being photographed. Then I noticed something horrifying. Several faces seemed familiar. Missing person cases I had seen in newspapers. Hikers who had vanished without explanation. People who were never found. Their photographs hung alongside countless others. At the center of the chamber stood a wooden table. Resting on it was a stack of newer photographs. The top image showed me. It had been taken earlier that day, while I was examining the cabin from outside. Someone had been watching me. Suddenly I heard footsteps echoing somewhere in the darkness behind me. Slow, deliberate. I turned my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. The footsteps continued. Closer now. Then another set joined them. Then another. Soon dozens of footsteps echoed through the chamber. They weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were approaching with absolute certainty. I grabbed the photograph and sprinted back toward the tunnel. The footsteps immediately quickened. The sound filled the underground chamber. It felt as though an entire crowd was chasing me through the darkness. I reached the staircase, slammed the basement door behind me, and ran from the cabin without looking back. Night had fully fallen by then. The forest was silent, too silent. As I hurried toward my vehicle, I noticed lights appearing between the trees. Lanterns, dozens of them. They moved slowly through the darkness, forming a loose circle around the clearing. Figures carried them. Human-shaped figures emerging from every direction. Their faces remained hidden in shadow. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes as I crashed through the forest. Behind me came the sound of many footsteps moving at the same pace. Never gaining ground, never falling behind, just following. After nearly an hour, I reached my truck and sped away from the mountains. I didn't stop until sunrise. The next morning, I convinced myself exhaustion and fear had distorted what I experienced. I decided to examine the photograph I had taken from the underground chamber. Maybe it would provide proof. Maybe it would reveal a rational explanation. Instead, it gave me something worse. The photograph showed me standing outside the cabin exactly as I remembered. But behind me, partially hidden among the trees, stood dozens of people, men, women, children. Every one of them stared directly at the camera. At first, I assumed they were strangers. Then I started recognizing faces, missing hikers, missing campers, missing hunters, people whose disappearances remained unsolved. And standing near the center of the group was Daniel. He looked older than when he disappeared, thinner, paler, yet unmistakably alive. Written across the bottom corner of the photograph in faded handwriting were 6 words that still haunt me today. We never really left the mountains. I burned the photograph that night. Or at least I tried to. The paper blackened around the edges, but never fully burned. Eventually, I buried it in a metal box behind my house. Sometimes I think about digging it up and seeing whether it's still there. Then, I remember what happened 3 nights ago. I woke up around 3 a.m. because someone was knocking on my front door. 3 slow knocks. Exactly 3. When I looked through the window, nobody was standing outside. But resting on the porch was a new photograph. It showed the cabin. The front door was open. And standing inside, the darkness beyond the doorway, was a figure holding a lantern, waiting as though it knew I would eventually come back.